If you don't want to read your own question or state your own question, then there's some paper and pens on the desk or the tables. You just write them down. Mr. Hatcher and I will come around and collect those, and we'll ask those for you, time permitting. Okay? Thank you. Thanks.
Well, I wanted to just welcome you, and on behalf of President Ginny Arthur and Provost Carol Borman-Young, welcome you to Metropolitan State University and tell you how excited we are that we are able to be the one place in Minnesota that is able to host this exhibit from the Smithsonian, and how pleased, very pleased we are that we have had our guests that are going to be presenters tonight, because they are very special people and you will get an opportunity to interact with them. I hope that all of you have had a chance to wander through the exhibit. If you haven't, that you'll take that moment. I was sitting down. There's a really nice way to sort of sit on the back side and sort of feel like you're sort of enmeshed in the march or in the experience. And I had a thought, because I just finished a book called Crusade for Justice. It's about the life of Ida B. Wells. And Ida B. Wells is one of those people, the names that sometimes people don't recognize as a part of the civil rights movement and about the sort of struggle that we had. And I was sitting there thinking about how many pictures on those posters are of people who were like her, that had such an important place in the history of this movement that we don't know about. So I hope you'll have that opportunity to do that. Bringing on an exhibit like this and hosting a program like this is no small feat for any university, and I want to take this opportunity to thank a number of organizations and individuals who have participated in the energy and the work that has brought this event together. You have printed in your program, for example, the organizers, which is the Eastside Freedom Library, the St. Paul Public Libraries, the Dayton Bluff Branch, from Metropolitan State University, the Center for Faculty Development, the College of Individualized Studies, the Department of Communication, Writing, and the Arts, the Facilities Department, the Gordon Parks Gallery, the Institute for Community Engagement and Scholarship, Library and Information Services, and our Student Senate are all been organizations that have played a part. I would also like to recognize a number of individuals who are part of our Changing America organizing committee, and I would ask them to stand if they aren't already, which most of them are, because they're standing around acting like their family. They can't sit down until everybody else has a seat. Right? From the Institute for Community Engagement under the direction of Greg Mellis, and Greg's here somewhere, we have a number of staff that were the primary people that organized this event. Jody Brantley, Jody, raise your hand. Victor, see, I told you they're all standing. Sarah, let's go in the back. Awa, is Awa in here? She's out there. Ahmed and Denny Yang, is Denny here? Okay. From the library, Martha Hardy, Kat Berwick, Martha standing in the back. From the St. Paul Public Library, Dayton Bluffs Branch, Emily Gonzalez, Emily here. Gordon Parks Gallery and CWA faculty, Erica Rasmussen, I saw her around earlier, get a chance to look at the gallery before you leave. And from the College of Individualized Studies, Stanley Hatcher, who will be part of your moderator. He's in the back of the room too. I wish if you would actually join me in giving them a hand for all the work that they've done. Again, welcome to Metro State. This is a wonderful opportunity for reflection for this community, and so we're very pleased that you're all here. And I have the opportunity to introduce then my colleague and friend, the Dean of the Library. She doesn't look old enough to be a dean, but she is a dean. I just wanted to say something. I wish I knew some like really weird fact about her that I could share. She likes birds. That's all I know. Anyway, ask her about that. So this is Chris Schaefer, the Dean of our library.
Wow, this is a packed room. I am so happy to be with you tonight and to have a chance to introduce our guest speakers, Petronella J. Ytsma and William P. Jones. Petronella is a community faculty member in studio arts at Metro State University. She is a professional photographer whose work focuses on social justice and ecological issues. She has a great understanding of the contributions Black American photographers made and continue to make to to our cultural landscape. Ms. Ytsma has had numerous art exhibitions, artist residencies in the United States and Berlin, Germany, and is currently staff photographer at Park Square Theater in St. Paul. William P. Jones is a professor of history at the University of Minnesota. Prior to his recent relocation to the Twin Cities, he was a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Jones is a prolific author. His most recent book, The March on Washington, Jobs, Freedom, and the Forgotten History of the Civil Rights, traces the civil rights movement from 1941 to 1964. His scholarship gives him a deep understanding of the events depicted in the Changing America exhibit. Finally, both panelists have very unique lenses through which they view tonight's topic, and I'm excited to learn from them. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Petronella J. Ytsma and William P. Jones.
Thank you all for coming, and thanks to Metro State and Smithsonian, Metro State. Oh, is it not on? Oh. So anyway, my gratitude. And I want to thank the faculty and staff for all the work that it took to bring this exhibit and event about. I'm very honored to have been asked to speak, although I'm a little more than daunted, partly because I read Will Jones' book, March on Washington, and it made me realize how many gaps I have in my own societal and cultural education. I think it's a very necessary read. It's not easy. I'm titling this the role of image in social justice movements from 1850 to 1960. I mean, 1850 to 2016. 153 years in 20 minutes. While I have, for these past many years, taught the history of photography, I came at the symposium as an outsider to those who have fearlessly and with great dignity recorded the life of the African American community since the mid-1800s, when the daguerreotype became a craze. For this presentation, I have chosen not to show quote-unquote traditional iconic images of the civil rights movement, as we can all conjure these up, and they've been covered extensively. At this moment, I think they need to be covered even more extensively, quite frankly. But I will instead show examples primarily of African American photographers in the larger pantheon of civil and human rights and self-representation. In no way is this comprehensive, nor does this address the broader communities of color, which could be another whole thing. One of the roles of image is to change the dialogue, whether personal, cultural, community representation demands for equal voice, societal place, safety, housing, education, employment. It speaks to a truth of existence. Ariella Azoulay, the Israeli author of The Civil Contract of Photography, speaks of the relationship between the maker, the subject, and the viewer of an image. And that, quote, a photograph demands to be watched and heard. It is not merely something that has been, but still is actively happening. We must actively engage with photographs with a sense of moral ethics and civil responsibility. The branded hand of Captain Jonathan Walker. Jonathan Walker, in 1844, attempted to assist 7 escaped slaves by sailing them from Florida to the West Indies. It was aborted and they were captured, and he went to jail. After he was released from jail, he got branded SS for slave stealer. This image has been called one of the earliest conceptual portraits in that a body part can stand for the total personality. Azoulay wrote, quote, "The daguerreotype had the power to publish the disgrace meant to exclude Walker from the public, and through this very act of publication to overturn the disgrace. Through the act of photographing and then publicizing something meant to invoke shame, Walker turned his punishment into a subversive political act." Frederick Douglass had over 160 portraits taken of himself over his lifetime because he felt it was imperative that African Americans should create their own visual narrative. And the purpose of that was to counter racist stereotypes. So the first one is 1847, second one 1874. And these are African American daguerreotypists who had working studios. James Ball actually employed 9 black men as daguerreotypists. Poets, prophets, and reformers are all picture makers. And this ability is the secret of their power and of their achievement. They see what ought to be by the reflection of what is and endeavor to remove the contradiction. Augustus Washington also used photography to elevate social and political position of the oppressed. This is a portrait of John Brown, an abolitionist and a proponent of better education for blacks. He ended up immigrating to Liberia in 1853. Du Bois, either America will destroy ignorance or ignorance will destroy the U.S. This is with his Fisk University graduating class in 1888. While at Fisk, he became concerned with the profound troubles of racism, and he compiled a series of photographs for the quote-unquote American Negro exhibit at the 1900 Paris Exposition. He organized 363 images into albums entitled Types of American Negroes, Georgia, USA, and Negro Life in Georgia, USA. He was the co-founder of the NAACP. He died the day before Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech, and he was living at that point in Ghana. Both Douglass and Du Bois called for black artists to create a counter-archive to negative and stereotypical caricatures that abounded. In his essay, Criteria of Negro Art, he argues that African American art must testify to African American identities, providing a record to challenge a long legacy of racist representation. We jump to 1898, Wilmington, North Carolina. Alex Manley, the editor of the Daily Record, printed an editorial about the taboo subject of interracial sex and exploitation of black women by white men. Within 48 hours, a white supremacist, Alfred Moore Waddell, led a group to take over the city government and burnt Manly's press building, killing a number of blacks and forcing many to flee. Ultimately, the Southern Democrats increased racist acts, reduced pay at work, and in 1900 passed a suffrage amendment to the North Carolina Constitution, eliminating African American voting rights and perpetuating segregation. By the 1890s, most Southern states began systematically disenfranchising blacks, imposing voter registration restrictions, literacy tests, poll taxes, etc. And there are a whole bunch of race riots for the next number of years that happened. I'm really nervous. This is just an image of African American soldiers who were going to World War I, being boarded onto a ship. President Wilson was a segregationist, and he maintained a racially separate military throughout the war, World War I. The suffrage movement of 1916, with women and men, but a lot of women wanting to prepare for World War I, seeking training in industrial settings, and also for better education. 1916 also was the Convention of Former Slaves. And I'm going to show you a couple of portraits, and these are all former slaves who are close to 100 or above 100 years old. They're quite dignified. The early 1900s became a time of the new Negro, and as scholar Henry Louis Gates Jr. wrote, it was a paradoxical metaphor that combined a concern with history and cultural antecedents with a deep concern for an articulated racial heritage that would establish once and for all the highly public basis of a once subjugated race. One of the better known photographers of that time period, James Van Der Zee, who spent over 50 years documenting in Harlem. Cultural critic Bell Hooks says, quote, "For black folks, the camera provided a means to document a reality that could, if necessary, be packed, stored, moved, hidden, passed around, an echo of the oral tradition." It was very important for James Van Der Zee to portray a revisionist and optimistic view of African American experience. He also photographed Marcus Garvey. This is taken at the Universal Negro Improvement Association Parade, 1924. Charles Harris, Teeny, best known for his photojournalism and the owner of a local photography business, the Harris Studio. It's a wonderful 4x5 negative portrait, self-portrait of him, and also a photo of him behind the police lines at a demonstration. He documented in Pittsburgh mid-century segregation, protests for fair employment rights, and general life. And he concentrated on documenting African American owned businesses at that point. This is a really great image because it's Eartha Kitt who helped launch the Citizens Committee on Hill District Renewal Program with a dramatic gesture in May 1966. The officer's name is Harvey Adams. Marian Palfy, a Polish-Hungarian American, wrote a photo essay that's really powerful called "There Is No More Time." This is a portrait of a lynch victim, Mrs. her husband. African Americans had long endured a physical and social landscape of white supremacy embedded in policy, social codes, racial restriction, and violence. By the 1950s, the Black Freedom Movement raised a collective call of no more. In 1965, Operation Exodus, later renamed the Metropolitan Council for Educational Opportunity, was established by a group of volunteers who fought to desegregate Boston's schools. Matt Herron won the World Press Photo Contest in 1965 for this series of policemen ripping an American flag from the hands of a young Anthony Quinn, who was attending this voting rights protest with his mother. Herron states, "It was very dangerous for a Black photographer to shoot any demonstration or some other public event. In addition to being a freelancer, it required equipment, money, and spare time to teach yourself photography. These resources were generally not available to Black kids." His book, Mississippi Eyes, tells the story of the tumultuous summer of 1964. He organized a team of 8 photographers and did the Southern Documentary Project, recording social change in the mid-60s. Black Panthers. A lot to be said for the Black Panthers, but all I'm going to say today is that J. Edgar Hoover said it was not the guns, but rather, this is a quote, "It was not the guns, but rather the free children's breakfast program that was the greatest threat to the internal security of the United States of America." The Black Panthers, among many other things, conducted armed patrols, emphasized community-based activism, voter registration drives, and ran more than 60 survival programs, medical, eye clinics, dental clinics, food co-ops, legal aid, screening for sickle cell anemia, child development centers, and better schools. Moneta Sleet won a Pulitzer Prize for this photograph. He's the first African American to be awarded a Pulitzer Prize in photography. In 1968, following the assassination of Dr. King, when Mrs. Coretta Scott King learned that the small pool of photographers covering her husband's funeral did not include a Black photographer, she sent out word that if Mr. Sleet were not allowed in the church and given a choice vantage point, there would be no photographers. Chester Higgins documented the African diaspora for over 30 years and really concentrated on Black spirituality. Stunning, stunning work. Robert Abbott Singstack. "We saw ourselves as graphic historians, conveyors of love, combating what we felt were negative photographic images of Blacks in the major American press. Whether we achieved recognition or not, we knew that someday people would look back and want to know what the Black photographer had to say about his experience." Jean Mutsami Ashe, the widow of Arthur Ashe, spent many years as a photographer, and one of her major projects was documenting the Daufuskie Islands in the Gullah people, with the purpose, again, the truth of existence. Kamoinga Workshop in 1963 was formed. It was a collective of African American photographers to help disseminate, sort of like Magnum was established. This was to elevate the photographic representation of African Americans, to transcend the stereotype of African Americans as victims of social oppression by endowing their subjects with grandeur, agency, and self-possession. Roy Carava was the first director of the Kamoinga. He did the Sweet Fly Paper of Life, which paired with Langston Hughes, which is a classic integration of prose and photography. First published in 1955, it's out of print. This is from his work, The Sound I Saw. Much of his work, he's an amazing photographer, and it's very, very lyrical, musical. This is a demonstrator, this is called Force, and it's a demonstrator being hauled off. And you actually have to look really closely at this, because it's almost an abstract image, but it's hands gripping the ankles of a woman, and she's being dragged from this demonstration. Carava said he wanted to create an equivalent for an insidious, almost imperceptible kind of force in society. This stronger and more pervasive force can also be used in the service of opposition. Indeed, the political element in his photography articulates quiet and powerful resistance. Phyllis Draper, one of the other co-founders of Kamoinga, says, "We speak of our lives as only we can." He wrote about the personal and individualistic perspective of the Kamoingas, African American photographers, and affirms that a multifaceted, richly textured, and global view of the Black experience. Draper called his photography, quote unquote, engaged resistance. I don't know how many of you know about this. In the 40s, the psychologist Kenneth Bancroft Clark, who was the first Black president of the American Psychological Association, and his wife, designed a test to study the psychological effects of segregation on Black children. They showed dolls, identical except for color, to Black children between ages of 3 and 7, and asked them questions to determine racial perception, and preference. Almost all of the children readily identified the race of the dolls, but the majority selected the white doll with more positive attributes. The Clarks concluded that prejudice, discrimination, and segregation caused Black children to develop a sense of inferiority and self-hatred. This was taken by Gordon Parks. There's a whole series of these. For Ebony magazine, they ran a big thing on it. The Supreme Court in 1954 used these social science findings in their determination that racially segregated schools were inherently unequal and unconstitutional. With Ralph Ellison, Gordon Parks published Invisible Man, which is a novel about search for African American identity. Parks insisted, when he was working for Life and other magazines, he insisted on also being able to write. And so and publishing and having editorial control over photo essays. He was in a number of Life magazines. This particular article was about a family in Harlem. What I want, what I am, what you force me to be is what you are. For I am you, staring back from a mirror of poverty and despair, of revolt and freedom. Look at me and know that to destroy me is to destroy yourself. You are weary of the long hot summers. I am weary of the long hungered winters. We are not so far apart as it might seem. There is something about both of us that goes deeper than blood or black or white. It is our common search for a better life and a better world. Freedom Riders in 1961 in Alabama. This was the firebombing of a bus, and the mob held the doors closed with the Freedom Riders inside while it was burning, and it was an undercover cop who actually ended up opening, forcing the mob away from the doors and letting people out. Charles Moore. Baldwin. What really exercises my mind is not this hypothetical day on which some other Negro first will become the first Negro president. What I'm really curious about is just what kind of country he'll be president of. And as we all know, there's been a lot of mythology about the first African American president. The Hope image is probably one of the most reproduced and most iconic images of the current time. And we all had mythologies about becoming post-racial. And it's pretty clearly not. With an estimated 1 million African Americans of working age languishing in prison by 2005, which is up nearly 900% since the 1950s, the degree of black incarceration has already reached startling proportions. In Angola, the Louisiana State Penitentiary, inmates work in the fields, and Louisiana receives subsidies on crops grown by the convicts. I think this is slave labor by another name. Dawood Bai, born in 1953, is a wonderful photographer. He did a project called the Birmingham Project in 2012. It commemorates the 4 young girls and the 2 boys whose lives were lost on 15 September 1963 in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. Without specifically referencing the incidents, the project serves as a memorial to lives lost, a message of hope, and a promise for the future. So one side is a photo of a girl who would be the age at which she lost her life, and then 50 years later. Carrie Mae Weems. Excuse me. Weems copied daguerreotypes from the collection at the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard University and used them to make this work. The Peabody found out about it and they were upset, and they didn't ask her to destroy the work, but they demanded that she not make any more of this work. Meanwhile, the Harvard Art Museum, which is totally separate from the Peabody, bought this version shown and championed these photos as powerful art, and that it must be allowed to be made. Lorna Simpson, another African American artist who uses photography, Does installations using photography and text exploring issues of race, gender, identity, and culture. The 21st century via social media and the internet offers a plethora of imagery with little breathing space. Here's a few still images of recent events. This is Devin Allen in Baltimore, 2015. These kind of images are become iconic, and they sort of harken back to other classic images. And the Mark Rebo is definitely one that's considered one of the all-time classic. Jonathan Bachman, Baton Rouge, 2016. Robert Cohen, 2014. This is in Ferguson, and this salon was burned down after a St. Louis grand jury declined to indict Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson in the shooting death of Michael Brown. Another Robert Cohen photo. This won a Pulitzer Prize. Again, post Michael Brown's death. Ernst Withers. Ernst Withers was one of the premier African American photographers during the main quote-unquote civil rights movement in the 50s, 60s, early 70s. And he was considered the original civil rights photographer. He has got a lot of controversy on him because apparently a lot of people believe that he was feeding the FBI info on demonstrators and protesters and other civil rights workers within the Memphis community. French artist J.R., who's known for his trademark black and white portraits that flank inner city communities, marked the 50th anniversary of the civil rights activist Martin Luther King "I Have a Dream" speech. And he also did the "I Am Man." So he does huge posters, public art. This is the one in Atlanta, Georgia, where King grew up on the anniversary. He also produced Eric Gardner's Eyes for the protest. I recently met Patience Zelenga, who is 23, a young African-American photographer involved with social justice movements. She says she often shoots in black and white to draw parallels between the contemporary struggles of Black Americans and the civil rights movement of the 60s. It forces you to pay attention to the subject and what's happening. Of this image, she says, he stood there patiently waiting for me to step out of the car to handcuff me. I refused. And as I kept refusing, I was hearing the screams and shouts of those who had already been slammed into the ground. I was the only one left in the car. All the others had already been arrested. Just me. I looked up at him. I remember having an overwhelming sense of confusion. I saw a black man. I saw a brother. I saw a cop. From that point on, I avoided his eyes when he was speaking. I couldn't allow him to see how hurt I was. Coretta Scott King. must remind you that starving a child is violence. Neglecting school children is violence. Punishing your mother and family is violence. Discrimination against a working man is violence. Ghetto housing is violence. Ignoring medical need is violence. Contempt for poverty is violence. She also said, the greatness of a community is most accurately measured by the compassionate actions of its members. Thank you.
Thanks, Neil. I also just want to thank Metropolitan State for inviting me here. It's my first public speech in since moving to the Twin Cities, so I'm glad to meet you all. Thanks for coming. I want to particularly thank Jody for inviting me and setting this up and arranging all this. I want to leave time for a discussion, so I want to move quickly. But I want to just say a few words to sort of frame a conversation around anniversaries and why we celebrate them. What do we commemorate? What do we remember? How do we look back? This is, I think, a particularly relevant conversation to have in this moment, in this decade, as we look back on the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Movement and the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. And that coincidence, or perhaps not a coincidence, I think is really the subject of this exhibit, and I think the subject of a lot of conversations that we're having today. So I want to ask why. What purpose does it serve to look back? What do we gain? What do we learn? I think it's important to remember that anniversaries and commemorations can often be misleading. A memorial, an act, they can be acts of forgetting as much as they are acts of remembering. And I think if we think of, just about the way in which many of us have been remembering the 1960s, for example, today we see often a sort of celebration of the 1960s that overlooks both the reality of the present and the difficulty of the past. Right? It's sort of a glossing over in a way that the remembering, I think, not only doesn't really help us remember, but perhaps helps us forget. It sort of obscures the reality, both of the present and the past. Another example of that that's less well known, there was actually a similar moment of celebration in the early 20th century surrounding the 50th anniversary of the Civil War. In 1913, veterans of the war gathered in Gettysburg to commemorate the 50th anniversary of that battle. And the way in which they did that was really an act of forgetting the war, of putting the war behind them. These were white soldiers from the North and the South who met. And there are pictures from these events of these veterans, these aged veterans shaking hands, standing with American flags and Confederate flags, and sort of putting the past behind them. African Americans were only invited to the celebration to clean up. So the way in which, here we have, I think this is something that we should remember as we're remembering another historic event, another historic period, the way in which that remembering can be as harmful as it is helpful. I think it's useful to hold on to that memory. In fact, the March on Washington in 1963 itself was a commemoration of the Emancipation Proclamation. It's interesting that actually was something of an afterthought. The idea for the immediate idea for the March on Washington, I read about in my book how the idea came in 1941, but the immediate idea for holding one in 1963 actually came very late in 1962. By the time anybody actually acted on it, A. Philip Randolph the Black union leader, his friend and assistant, Bayard Rustin, they started to put a plan together in January of 1963. The Emancipation Proclamation was signed on January 1st, 1963, so by that point they were actually too late for the anniversary. They missed the anniversary. I actually imagine them sitting around, reading the newspaper and saying, oh yeah, oh look, it's the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, we should do something about that. But obviously by that point, they were too late. The actual idea for the march, I think, was more focused on the present than on the past. And from the beginning, the past, the sort of commemoration of the Emancipation Proclamation, was in some ways a sort of a hook, a media tool that they used to promote the march. As I said, the idea for the march came 20 years earlier. On July 1st, 1941 was the original date of the march, which again didn't have any sort of historical significance. And that march, in fact, was called off at the last minute before it took place. The organizers of the march tried again on May 17th, 1957. This was actually a commemoration of the 3rd anniversary of the Brown decision. So this was a much more immediate sort of cause. And their complaint was really that since the Supreme Court had ruled in 1954 that the segregation of schools violated the Constitution, nothing had happened, that there had been no action toward implementing the Supreme Court decision. In fact, the President Eisenhower had explicitly said that he was not going to enforce the issue. So again, this was a commemoration, but it was really focused on a very contemporary issue. That march was actually much smaller than they had hoped. It was a significant event, but not nearly what they had hoped. And so that's why we get to January of 1963, A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin sitting around talking about reviving the idea of a march on Washington. A. Philip Randolph, initially, his proposal was for a march on Washington for jobs. As he said, he wanted to draw attention to what he called the economic subordination of the Negro. He wanted to call for jobs for Black and white workers, and what Bayard Rustin called a broad and fundamental program for economic justice. This was an extremely popular idea among Black activists early in 1963. It gained a lot of attention. It reflected A. Philip Randolph's concern about rising unemployment in Black working class communities, mostly in the urban North. And this was, in some ways, a paradox. It was a time in the early 1960s when the US economy was actually growing very rapidly, but because of automation, Black workers who had been fighting for decades to get into auto plants and other manufacturing plants in the North, were seeing their job prospects disappear. And this was the main focus that A. Philip Randolph called for. He was particularly opposed to discrimination in employment both by employers and by unions. And in fact, the initial idea was actually to march on the AFL-CIO's national headquarters to protest discrimination by the labor movement. This was an idea that gained a lot of attention, particularly among Black trade unionists who had been fighting within their own unions to break down discriminatory measures and force their unions to sort of live up to the rhetoric of equality that they all supported. But it also gained a little bit of criticism from Black activists who argued that this was too narrow of a proposal, that the issue of jobs was important, was a critical issue for Black communities, particularly in the urban North. But they pointed out that there was a really vibrant movement for integration, for voting rights, for access to public schools and public spaces in the South, and there needed to be a way to unite those. The principal voice in doing that, I'm curious if anybody has ever heard of her, Anna Arnold Hedgeman. Raise your hand if you've ever heard this name. Okay, she's a she was a native of Anoka. She went to Hamline College. And she was actually, besides A. Philip Randolph and Barry Rustin, probably the single most important person in building the March on Washington. She's a native of this area. I encourage you to go out and look her up. There's actually a really wonderful new biography of her out. And she's been largely forgotten from this history. She's actually pictured in the exhibit, so look for her in the exhibit. She was the person who went to A. Philip Randolph and said, this can't be a sole focus on jobs. And she actually proposed to change the slogan for the march to a March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which became the official slogan of the march, and reflected that sort of marrying of, in some ways, two black freedom movements. One in the urban north was largely labor-based, one in the south that was focused on voting rights and integration. The date for the march obviously wasn't going to be the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. They had already missed that in January. So they chose August 28th. Does anybody know what that was actually an anniversary? It was the 8th anniversary of the murder of Emmett Till. And in that way, I think the march sort of encompassed, again, sort of brought up that it marked an anniversary, but a very recent anniversary, and reflected a contemporary issue, this wave of racist violence against both black activists in the South and just children, like Emmett Till, who wasn't an activist, who had been murdered while visiting family. He was from Chicago. So the main focus, again, of this march, while I think it's tempting to think of it as a sort of commemoration of this event, was not commemoration, but the present, the sort of urgency of the present. The marchers used history. One of the things that it was really wonderful to me about writing this book is A. Philip Randolph, the principal organizer of this march, was a tremendous historian. He would, in every one of his speeches, it was a little history lesson. Sometimes in 10 minutes, often his speeches would go on for 2 hours sometimes. But he would always sort of paint the history of the civil rights movement then in the context of a long history that really followed his own lifetime. He was born just after Reconstruction, and he was involved in the union movement of the 1920s and 1930s, and he sort of painted the civil rights movement in this long arc. So he was very aware of history. We're all familiar with Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington, in which he also used history to chastise America. As he began, he said, 5 score years ago, a great American, referring to Abraham Lincoln, signed the Emancipation Proclamation, but then he moved very quickly to the present. He said, but 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives in a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. And he said the purpose of the march was to dramatize this shameful condition. So King didn't dwell on history, he used it, but he didn't dwell on it. He focused primarily on the present, on the problems of segregation, of disfranchisement, of poverty. And perhaps most importantly, I think, he painted an image of the future. So he sort of used this historical message to talk about what he saw as what he called his dream of an egalitarian society. So he was, and I think we'll all agree that what's most powerful about that speech is his vision of the future, of what could be. And I think this is perhaps the lesson that we can take away from this moment of reflection and retrospection, which is that history is powerful. I'm a historian, I get paid for this, so I'm not going to tell you it's worthless, but it's certainly not enough. And it needs to be coupled, I think, very closely with attention to the present and a vision for the future. History can remind us of lost promises, what Dr. King called the promissory note of the Emancipation Proclamation. He talked about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. But many of the issues that were raised in 1963 remain the same. The issues of economic insecurity and rising both economic and racial inequality, of discrimination and racist violence. At the same time, I think we need to be aware of what has changed and sort of the relationship between those two. We need to remember history, but I think we need to keep focused on the present. And perhaps I think most importantly, we need to project a vision of the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another round of applause for our two speakers tonight. Okay, transition to questions and answers. I'm just going to give you 1 minute to sit with all that information. Let it kind of sink in. And then if you have a question, Mr. Hatcher will call on you and I'll bring you a microphone. Or if you want to write it down, then I'll collect it and bring it around, okay? So we're just going to take 1 minute right here, collect